What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
Ryan, this is number 6, man. How crazy is that? Your sixth time.
Insane.
I can't believe it.
That's crazy.
I know, but I'm glad you're here, man. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
So I want to start. Your latest book is called Courage is Calling. And I actually turned to the back of the book this morning, and you wrote a story from the first person in the afterword that I think was kind of personal to, or definitely personal to you. And you had to show some courage. And I think you did some good and maybe not so good throughout it, as far as the strength you had to stand up to a really powerful person. And so maybe I can set the stage, and I'd love for you to tell that story as a way for us to get started. You were working at American Apparel, and there is a leader there named, I believe he's this founder CEO named Dove Charney. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
And Dove had asked you to do something that, quite frankly, is, I think, kind of illegal and certainly morally wrong. But maybe you can take it from there and share what you learned from that story.
So I was the director of marketing at this company called American Apparel, which was at one point one of the fastest and hottest fashion brands in the world. And I started there when I was like 20 or 21. And sort of that's where I started. Dove was a mentor of mine, sort of discovered me. It was really cool. It was certainly a controversial company, not without its critics. And he was very much let's just say nicely, a very flawed person. Certainly not a person who would have their job in the Me Too era today, for good reason. And I had kind of a strange relationship with the company in that I sort of started there and was discovered there, but I'd sort of had one foot on a path towards becoming a writer. And towards the end of what was going to be my time there anyway, Dove came to me. He was being sued for sexual harassment by 3 women. And I don't know the specifics of the case exactly. It was certainly not the first time this had happened. And there's definitely a case of where there's smoke, there's fire. But in any case, he had been in a relationship with these women, and he believed that they were taking advantage of him, that they had had a consensual sexual relationship, and then now they were sort of making it seem like they were the victims. And he believed he had proof of this in the form of pictures and text messages between him and the people. Now, I had actually warned him that he had to stop doing this. Like it didn't matter if they were consensual relationships or not. It was not a good idea to have relationships with your employees. But more importantly, if you've already been in trouble for it before, whether you were falsely accused or not, you're setting yourself up for this to happen again if you continue to put yourself in the position. So anyways, he comes to me one day and he says, I have sort of this proof of this stuff. And I was not just the director of marketing, but the company's spokesperson. So it was always my responsibility to respond to media inquiries, to put out the company's sort of point of view, and in many cases to defend him. So anyways, he came to me with these photos, which he showed me. And they were photos that made it seem like it was a consensual relationship, and certainly was a sexual relationship between the two of them. And he asked me to leak these photos to Gawker and a bunch of other websites. And I said, this is a horrible idea. You do not want to do this, nor should you do this, nor do I think, can you do this? And on top of all that, I'm definitely not going to do it. And so, I sort of patted myself on the back at the moment, like, hey, this is where I'm drawing the line. Should I have drawn the line much earlier? Yes, of course. But that was where I drew the line. And that was not a thing that you did at that company if you wanted to keep your job. I mean, the point of working for a person is that they get to tell you what to do, right? So it was not unconsiderable amount of risk to do this. I mean, there were no immediate consequences for me, but it was very clear that our relationship would be different going forward for having made this decision. And so I sort of patted myself on the back for doing this. And yet, a few weeks later, as I walk into his office or walk by his office or something, he calls me in, and he's in the middle of a conference call, like a Zoom call or something, with a bunch of different reporters on different outlets, different media outlets, sort of off the record, where he is just leaking the photos himself directly. So I didn't do it, but I didn't stop it from being done. And it struck me then that, sort of courage to just draw your own personal line was not sufficient. I probably should have done something about it. It was also a strange experience for me in that, I watched these media outlets publish this story as if there wasn't a problem with what was happening. Same media outlets who years later would criticize people for enabling Dove, or, that he's sort of presenting him as this monster, as if it wasn't a symbiotic relationship between a lot of different parties. But anyways, the point is, I tell the story in the back of the book because it's a book about courage, about doing the right thing. There's multiple forms of courage, physical and moral. But I felt like it would be very dishonest to write a book about courage and then pretend as if, one, having never served in the armed forces or sort of had to undergo any real sort of physical danger, it would still be dishonest for me to act as if I have always been courageous in my own life. So I wanted to tell a story not about courage, but about, I don't want to say cowardice, but I would say where courage failed, right? Failed me in that moment. I thought I was doing a scary thing, but I wasn't pushing myself far enough. And in retrospect, I think about why I didn't do it. I was obviously afraid of losing my job, but at the same time, I was thinking about leaving the job anyway, right? I knew it was wrong, and yet because someone else was intent on doing it, I felt like, as long as I wasn't participating, that was sort of sufficient. So I just really wanted to talk about sort of how that all transpired, because I think what I found, and I talk about this in the book, the idea that like I was scared or I was afraid or I was worried about what would happen to me is not an excuse that ages well. It does not look very good in retrospect. So like, even as I'm trying to describe to you the reasons, it's like impossible to ever convey whatever was going through your head at the moment. And all that's left is what you didn't do, where you fell short. And so to me, it was sort of an encapsulation of the message of the book, which is like, this is precisely why in those moments, you're almost certainly better off going bigger than you are smaller. And, I just think about, let's say the worst case scenario had happened. I said, I'm not going to do this. You can't do this. I'm going to the board of directors, if this doesn't happen. What would have happened? I mean, let's say I would have lost my job. Okay. But I don't know if my life would have turned out that differently. Maybe it would have. But the thing, I mean, it's complicated, because as I look back, I was able to continue to do good while I worked there and prevent things from happening that shouldn't have happened. But it all comes back to the idea, if you can't stop something like that from happening, what good is being the adult in the room? So that's sort of the message of that story.
I feel like, as I've obviously followed you for a while, we've got to know each other a bit, and I feel like you're almost stepping into your own about not having as much fear or not being afraid to upset people, to take a stand for things that you believe in publicly. You own a bookstore now, and you've faced controversy. You've had people write you mean letters. You've had people criticize you. You publish these things for all of us to see on social media and areas. You've got certainly your share of haters now. You definitely have people who love you, but you become, I feel like maybe as you've gotten a little bit more famous, more polarizing, which I guess happens if you're willing to kind of stand up. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel about growing into this? I feel, because I don't know if the first time we talked, you were as at the place that then that you, and that was what, 5 years ago, that you are now. And I sense like I'm just like witnessing you kind of coming into this.
Well, that's very kind. I mean, I think part of it is rooted in confidence and security and sort of who I am and what I've done. Um, there's a great anecdote about Lyndon Johnson. This is after Kennedy's assassination. He begins to ram through the civil rights legislation that Kennedy had been unable to do, but that as a Southern Democrat, you'd think Lyndon Johnson would have been particularly unable to do, or perhaps resistant to do. But he sort of senses that this is a moment and he pushes it through. And some advisor says, like, you shouldn't do this. There's going to be the following consequences or whatever. And he says, what the hell is the presidency for? Right. And his point was, what is the point of becoming successful at whatever you do, or amassing the power that you told yourself? And this is what we do. We tell ourselves, when I'm in a position of influence or power, or I cross off certain boxes, then I will be willing to do X, Y, or Z. The problem is we never actually feel like we've arrived. And then once we have those things, then we're actually perversely afraid of losing them. So we're actually more risk averse than we were before. So I mean, this is something I think about. I mean, I've definitely written things and said things that I know over the last year that I deeply believe in, whether it's for the pandemic or certain causes, that certainly have cost me either audience or goodwill, or at the end of the day, all this comes down, eventually gets translated into financial terms. Definitely be better for me financially to walk more of a middle path, and not say things that are polarizing or whatever. But I go back to that idea of like, what is this for? Like, what is, I sometimes I say that to people when they send me sort of nasty emails or whatever about like, I'm unsubscribing. Why did you have to say this or that? And I go, look, I didn't build this platform. I didn't work really hard to become a writer to then not say what I think, right? And then this comes back to courage, to not say what I think for fear of pissing a random person I don't care about off, right? Like, obviously you care about your audience, but the point is like, I did not build the things that I've built and do the things that I've done to then censor myself in advance out of fear of negative consequences. And who better to bear those negative consequences than someone who can actually afford to do it, right? Like there were points in my career where, and this is the tension to go back to what we're talking about in American Apparel, you're always telling yourself, oh, when I get here, I'll be able to do it. But, there were points in my career where, it's not that you can't rock the boat, but like, you have more to lose. Yeah. And so I just feel like, if not now, when, as the famous question goes.
What advice would you give to somebody, let's say they work at they have a really good job, work at a big company in like a VP of something role, right? They have a team, they report up to somebody, there's a board, right? Multi-billion-dollar company, whatever. Like kind of the avatar for the show. And they're like, I got a family, I got mortgage, I got a great job, and it might be a pain to kind of replace this. So I don't want to get fired. So I just kind of, and I empathize with this. I feel this. I get this. And they could say, well, it's easy for you to say, Ryan, you can just keep writing books, probably making millions in advances alone. And I can't do that. And so what do you say to that person?
Yeah, well, I don't know about the exact financial figures you quoted, but there's a great F. Scott Fitzgerald story called The Four Fists. And it's about this guy who sort of says whatever he thinks and is willing. The Four Fists. Okay. Yeah, like their fist. Yeah. And I was going to include it in the book. I didn't have. I ended up cutting in some of the later edits. But he talks about this exact thing where basically this guy is this successful business. He's sent to negotiate some deal, and it's like one of those things where it's sort of like good for the company but bad for this small town, right? He's sort of like trying to trick people into selling their land or something like this. And he eventually realizes what the company is trying to do. And he, instead of deceiving the people in a way that would be good for them, he tells them like what's really going on, which of course, runs the risk of costing him his job. And he says, F. Scott Fitzgerald says something like, in these moments of righteousness or doing the right thing, there's also kind of a perverse selfishness, because the consequences of this are borne not just by you, but by your family. I had Alexander Vindman on my podcast recently. The episode hasn't run yet, but he's the whistleblower who not only takes on Trump, but as a result loses his job, and his brother loses his job at the White House. And I talked to him about this, and I said, did you think about that? Because not only did these other people, but it's hard to tell your daughter that you can't pay for college because you lost your job. Speaking up about X, Y, or Z, and I think I like to think about people like that who sort of actually did it with real stuff on the line. Like losing Twitter followers or email subscribers. These are not that significant in the long run of things. But the way I kind of think about it is like the alternative isn't tenable either. To not say what you think, to not offend someone who's offended by something that's clearly wrong or incorrect or contrary to your values, is not a tenable status quo or a sustainable status quo. So it does feel selfish, but it's also reckless to think that you can walk this tightrope forever, Yeah. And so I don't know. I guess I try not to think about it, honestly. I just try to default to what I think I should say, and not let my sort of what do they call it, the counsel of your fears, not let those weigh in. And then I try not to think about I've had to work more in the last year. It's actually been a tension for me. So like I kind of thought for a long time that I was like on the same page with my audience on most things. Mm-hmm. And the last couple of years, like my stuff has really taken off at a level that I don't think I had fully comprehended. And it was only maybe a few months ago that it occurred to me, as I was kind of depressed and frustrated with like what people would say on social media or emails I would get. And then I realized like, these aren't my people. These are just people who have heard of my stuff and come, but they don't actually know what it's about or I'm about. So losing them isn't actually losing, it's not that they don't matter, but I'm not alienating the core base. I'm alienating people who were only temporarily and incorrectly sort of on the bus because they thought we were going in one direction, but actually we've always been going in this direction. Does that make sense?
It does. It actually makes me think of my friend Brooke Cups, who I've had on the show. He's a basketball coach, just won a state championship. He's one of the most impressive people I know. And I asked him, like, when you go to interview for a job to be a coach somewhere, like, what do you do? Because he's really like sure of himself, super confident, really quiet though, like doesn't need his voice to be heard, which is rare for a coach. And he's like, and I said, so like, what do you say? Like, how do you impress him in the interview? And he goes, well, I have my core values, and I talk about how I live my core values, and I talk about how my team will live our core values. And then I say, well, what if they're not into that? And he goes, well, good. I'm not going to work there.
Right.
I don't want to work there. And he's like, I'd rather find that out now. And it was just so simplistic. It was so to the point. It was so direct. It was so confident. And I thought, yes, that's how I want to be. Like, I really like that outlook of like, well, then that's good. I don't want to work there. I don't want to, those are not my people. Right. Like, that's the thing. I feel like that's the sense I hear from you.
Well, and that's where, like, sort of looking back at this American Apparel thing, why I say this in the after, why was I afraid of losing a job over a thing that if you lost your job over that, it's not a place that you should work, like, it shouldn't have been happening to begin with. But to lose your job over that, I think with a little bit of distance, you'd feel grateful. You'd feel like you dodged a bullet, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the tension is, and I thought about this during the beginning of the pandemic. Remember, there was the aircraft carrier that pulls into New York City. It was the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The guy in charge of that ship, Captain Brett Crozier, I think. Basically, there's a COVID outbreak on the ship, and he's trying to sort of get people to, this is like the first time this has happened, he's trying to get people to take it seriously, and nobody is. And finally, he sort of goes public with it in a way that sort of breaks the chain of command, and it ultimately costs him command of an aircraft carrier and essentially his career. And I think people go, oh, well, that's obviously what you would do if, people's lives were on the line. That's what you should do. But it's not obvious for one reason. You don't get in command of an aircraft carrier by always doing the selfless thing, right? Like we think about this with CEOs. Like the CEO gets the top of this company, and then we're like, why are they so conservative? I don't mean politically. Why are they so risk averse? Like, why aren't they doing this or that? Why aren't they speaking up about this or that? It's because they didn't work for 40 years in the bowels of this company, working their way up through the ranks because they rocked the boat, right? Like they are by definition risk averse company men and women. That's how you get that job. And so often it's this paradox where what you have to do to get yourself in a position of leadership or management or power requires you to be risk averse. I think, this is to me what is, we can get into the details of it if we want, Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan, despite a lot of criticism and a lot of heat and the inevitability of that never going well. A lot of people were very concerned that, and again, I don't think this is political, that a guy who's been in the Senate for 40 years was sort of a creature of the status quo and the institutions and would not make sort of bold, strong, apolitical decisions. And the fact that he did that it is extremely, it cannot be overstated how hard it is to get go along to get along for the vast majority of your career, and then change strategies or personalities once you finally have the keys. And that's also what's impressive about Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, for the entirety of his political career, is a Southern Democrat who does nothing about racial issues, does nothing about discrimination, nothing about segregation. And then suddenly when he's president, I mean, most of his friends thought he was a traitor. I mean, we don't see that because we know in retrospect it was obviously the right thing. But to radically change from being a conservative, maintain the present way of things, to being a radical, sort of forward-thinking progressive figure in regards to even one specific issue, that just doesn't happen. People don't do that.
Yeah. Speaking of another military leader, I love the General Mattis stuff, and I know it seems like you've built a relationship with him, and you quote him a few different times. But I want to talk about first one. We might get to more than one of this, but there's the cool thing about this book, I would say, just for anybody, Courage is Calling, is the fact that it's just a bunch of extremely well researched short stories that have a key theme or point, and you just keep. I think I'll find, for the people especially who listen to this show, you'll find yourself taking a bunch of notes and having like a lot of kind of quips and vignettes to follow that will help you. And it's just bam, 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 nonstop. But anyway, so I'm going to get into Mattis.
Okay.
My little commercial for your book, but I obviously wouldn't say it. People know if I don't mean it. If there's a book on here that I don't love, I just kind of, we talk about something else. But anyway,
I know that exact dance.
Okay. You have to do it now too. So anyway, or I usually don't have them on the show. Okay. Sure. So Mattis says, you talk about a philosophy of offense, which I from a sports perspective, I always played offense, so I love that. But a TV reporter once asked him, "What keeps you up at night?" And Mattis goes, "I keep people up at night." And I just love that thought process of he's got a bias for action. And I remember Don Miller said this too on the show, and Don's a good dude, but he just said, when I think about people who add value to the lives of others, they always have a bias for action. Like they are going. It doesn't mean they're not thoughtful. It doesn't mean they don't have a plan, but they are making things happen. And I sense this is a part of courage, is having this philosophy of offense as we're going to go. And I think from a leadership perspective, like your default mode being as one that we're going to go, I sense is something that I think people should really think about.
That's right. Churchill was talking about a World War I general. I think he encapsulated the man by saying he had a sincere desire to engage the enemy, right? And unfortunately, that's not the status quo. People are conflict averse, they're competition averse, they are challenge averse. So they go towards what's easiest or what is the same. And this holds them back in a lot of ways. But it's the problem with engaging the enemy, to extend the metaphor, is that you could lose, right? Like, so risk aversion is a real thing, but it's also inherently self-protective. What you don't risk, you cannot lose. And so I think when you look at someone like Mattis, or you look at a lot of great, NFL coaches or CEOs or whatever it is, it's a sincere desire to engage, to push the boundaries, to step forward, to try. Theodore Roosevelt talks about the man in the arena. It's are you in the arena, or are you waiting for the perfect scenario to enter the arena? So I think that's really important, although I'm just writing about this now. So this book is the first book in a 4-book series. The next book is on self-discipline or temperance. Of course, this sincere desire to engage the enemy also has to be balanced out, not with conservatism, but with a sense of limits and timing and the self-control to not engage when you're unlikely to be successful, or you're more likely to be successful at a future date, at a future engagement. So, Churchill famously is, as we were saying, a sincere desire to engage the enemy. But 2 pivotal moments in the Second World War come when Churchill refuses to send the Royal Air Force out into France when France is overrun by the Nazis, despite many people begging him to do so. He said, no, the decisive moment is going to come later, when the Nazis try to invade Germany. And then secondarily, the idea of an invasion, like landing what became Normandy, this was something that the Allies talked about doing as early as 1942. Churchill holds off for 2 years before he gives final approval for what becomes D-Day, because he believed they weren't ready yet, and he refused to risk men and women and resources that he knew he could not afford to lose at that juncture. So this sincere desire to engage the enemy has to also be balanced out with self-control and discipline. Aristotle famously talks about how courage is on a spectrum. You have cowardice on one end, but then you have recklessness on the other end. So this sincere desire to engage the enemy, it actually has to rest as a midpoint between these 2 extremes. And that's where courage sits. It's not reckless. It's also not risk aversion.
I think the power of poise also plays into this. You've also written about in the year is that what we say? 175. Marcus Aurelius was betrayed by one of his generals, Avidius Cassius. Again, every time I talk to you, I mispronounce words. In an attempted coup, but you write that he could have been scared, he could have been furious, he could have exploded, but this would not happen. He said, quote, "The nearer a man is to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength." And I love this story because it reminds me of so many of the impactful leaders in my life, where they certainly weren't afraid to go, and they had an offensive mindset, but they also had this poise about them. And a great quarterback plays the same way. There's always bullets flying, like metaphorically bullets flying around you. You're in the midst of chaos, and you have to make good decisions with everything happening. And I think that's been such good training for life. And this story about this, the nearer a man is to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength. I think a lot of us leaders can take so much from studying this part of your book to help them be better in their world of leading a team at a business where there's always something, there's always craziness happening, and they have to figure out a way to to make it happen despite all of that.
Well, yeah, to use the quarterback example, you see this with a lot of young quarterbacks, which is that under pressure, when they don't see the options that they like, they still force the throw anyway. So it takes a certain amount of courage in that situation to either take a sack, which nobody wants to get hit, to throw the ball away, or to, you know, sort of shovel it off in a shorter pass that maybe you don't like, that's not as sexy, that no one's going to throw you a parade for. So the idea of having the discipline, again, all the virtues are interrelated with each other, but to have the discipline to say, it's not that I'm afraid, I will take the shot when it makes sense, but to go, I have enough confidence and security in myself to say, this is not that shot. And then I'm going to bear the consequences while I wait for that right shot. And that's extraordinarily difficult to do.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the difference between being scared and afraid.
Yeah.
So
that's from Faulkner, actually. Faulkner says, you know, be scared. You can't help that, but don't be afraid. And I think scared is a temporary state. Being afraid is like a state of being. So, you know, you can be scared when something scary happens, but if you carry the effects of that forward, if you're now gun shy, or you won't get back up on the horse, or whatever, you know, sort of metaphor you want to use, now you've transitioned from that sort of momentary emotional reaction into sort of absorbing it as a trait. And this is where we get into trouble.
One of the big things I feel like that's helped with me, Ryan, is I learned in high school from great coaches about the value of preparation.
Sure.
And those two coaches in particular that taught me about how preparation could build confidence, how preparation could help with fear. They were always the most prepared people, and them as the leaders made me feel more confident as a player, because I knew my coach was more prepared than anybody. And you write about preparation making you brave. And you said, as Epictetus says, the goal when we experience adversity is to be able to say, quote, this is what I've trained for this is my discipline. And so maybe you can relate some of this preparation talk from history to how that relates to leaders in real life on a day-to-day basis right now.
Well, I think there's two parts there. One, what you're talking about with the coaches is this idea that calm is contagious. Mm-hmm. If the coach is prepared, if the coach knows their shit, that trickles through the organization. And so, and actually, military historians talk about this. The act of being courageous is not simply an individual act. The choice to be courageous or cowardly has a contagious effect on the people around you. So showing up, doing your job, not being rattled, this is more important than it might feel. I think this is true as a parent. This is true as a owner of a business. This is true as a citizen. You think about in an economic panic, are you contributing to it by running to the bank, by selling all your stocks, by believing that all is lost, or are you contributing to the calm by buying, sticking, carrying on as usual? So I think calm is contagious, a really important lesson, but this idea of preparation is part of that. It's easy to be calm when you've prepared for this specific scenario. If you haven't, it will be scary. People ask me all the time about public speaking, like, are you scared when you go up on stage? If I don't know what I'm talking about, I am, like if this is something I haven't thought about, if I've been distracted or procrastinated and I haven't prepared, then yeah, I am a little scared because it could go really bad. I mean, I'm generally not scared because I've even done that enough times that I'm confident in my ability to improvise and salvage it. But there's always a difference between giving a talk for the first time and giving a talk for the 100th time, or giving a talk on a topic that you feel very confident about and very aligned with who you are and your values. And, sometimes like the ones I've been nervous about have been like where I took somebody's advice about how a change I should make, or I'm trying to imitate somebody else or something else. When you're being inauthentic, that's scary because you have a secret that you're hiding from the audience, which is that this isn't really who you are and you don't really believe this. So preparation is a huge part of being calm under pressure, because it's actually not that scary to you. You've been through this before.
And Jim Collins brought this up when we recorded a few times. He said the reason that he is an over preparer for everything he does and all the people he works with is he related to like an NFL coach who's really good, like a Sean McVay or somebody who, when you're so prepared and the game plan is so ready and you've worked so hard on it, when it comes time and the lights are bright, you can let your instincts take over.
Yeah.
You can just go, you can call the game, you could play the game, you could just go. So like speaking wise, I feel that completely. When I am super, super prepared, it makes it seem like you're out there just talking and telling stories. It's like a great stand-up comedian, the great ones who have whittled down their act down to the smallest syllable. They've worked so hard on it so that it looks like they're just out there wandering around, just talking, telling random jokes. They make it look easy. And I think from a leadership perspective, this is the key, is if you choose and you raise your hand to say, I want to lead, whether it's on the battlefield, on a sports field, in the business world, that's part of the deal. I think that's part of the responsibility of saying, I'm going to do that work. It's hard. It takes more time. It's not for everyone, but I think that's what the great ones are willing to do.
Yeah. And if you're not willing to do it, who do you think is doing it? Right. So if you did raise your hand, you did say, I want to be in charge. And now people are dependent on you or looking to you. And they're going to sense it if you're full of shit. They're going to sense it if you are scared. And I think, it's important to realize that the person on the other side of that, that's what they're looking for. They want to see that you don't quite believe that you're prepared, that you don't really have a plan, that you can be rattled. And that's what they exploit. I think I've talked about this before, but I think when you talked about Sean McVay, I think when you look at that Jared Goff, Tom Brady Super Bowl, the brilliance of Belichick's game plan there was, we're going to make this really frustrating for Jared Goff, and he's not going to be resilient enough to bounce back from this. And Tom has been through this enough times that he's played shitty Super Bowls and good Super Bowls, and he's come back from things. The game, he doesn't care how the game goes. He just wants to get to the finish line, right? Whereas I think they sort of took the offense away from the Rams. And I say this with some sadness. I'm friends with Les Snead and actually Sean as well. But I think they took what typically went well for the Rams away from them, and they just didn't. There wasn't a plan B, and knowing that that was I think they felt that was the only way we could win, and when it wasn't working, they didn't believe in it. And so that's where courage comes in. It's like, I know, like when I sit down on a project, I don't think like, of course this is going to go well. Of course it's going to come easy. Of course it's going to be fun. I know I can gut this out. Like, I know I can do this on just sort of raw tenacity alone. I hope I don't have to. I have a plan for why I don't have to, but I go into it not scared by it, because like I've done it 10 or 11 times now. I'm not worried about whether I have enough gas to finish the marathon. I know I have that. It's really just a question of how it's going to go, not if I'm going to make it.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring up one more Mattis quote, and then I want to dig a little bit into your process because I'm still fascinated by that.
Okay.
I know we've briefly spoke about. So this is about caring, because as I've really been working with leaders recently, especially my friend Sam Kaufman, this comes up with him all the time. It's like his number one word that he's about. And when you ask other people about him, they'll say, God, that guy cares. And my dad told me when I took my first leadership job, he said, let me tell you something, man, like the first thing that you must do is you got to care about your people. And it's a lot harder when you care. And I was like, wait, what does that even mean? And you really think about it, I'm like, yeah, it's easier not to care. It's easier just to chill out. And Mattis says, cynicism is cowardice. It takes courage to care, right?
Yes.
Like brave people believe, especially when everyone else is full of doubt. And I think this is critical though. And it sounds simplistic, like, well, yeah, of course I care. Of course I got to care. But no, like it's easier to be a cynic. Mm-hmm. It's easier to be a coward, I think, than it is to actually stand up and say you care, not only about yourself, but about all the people that you are serving, that you are leading. And I think this is something for leaders to think about, is how much do you care? How do you show that you care?
Although I would make a distinction. I think obviously it's very important to care about the people who work for you, but I don't think it's quite that. That's not the care exactly we mean.
Okay.
Like it's easy to say like, it doesn't matter, it's impossible. In what I think what Mattis is talking about specifically is about believing that an individual can make a difference, right?
Okay.
So the cynicism is it's rigged, it's unfair, the system is broken, none of this matters, I'm just going to get what's mine. Obviously this is related to caring about people, but I think it's a larger sense of like, it's easier to be a nihilist than it is to be a believer in something or people or some cause. I actually have a little email that I printed out that I had an email exchange with General Mattis, who as you said, I'm a huge fan of. But I was talking about, I forget what it was earlier this year. Things really looked like they were falling to pieces. And I just said, where does this go? It doesn't look like it could go anywhere well. Like, I was depressed and sort of disillusioned. Mm-hmm. And he said something about how, things always look this bad before they turn around. And I said, well, look, you've seen some dark shit, right? If you still have hope, what excuse do I have? And he said, he just replied, he said, keep the faith, Ryan, hold the line. Which is what I very much needed to hear then. And it's something I need a reminder of. So when we're talking about caring, it's not just, hey, I want to make sure these people are okay, or I want to pay them well. It's also like not giving up, or not saying that it's hopeless or impossible, or that it doesn't matter. It's easy to look at everything that's happening in the world and just go, it's a lost cause. But that is a form of cowardice. The person who says, no, actually, I still have hope. I still believe. Here's what I think we can do. Here's what I'm going to try to do. That takes an immense amount of courage. You think about, I tell a story towards the back of the book of John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who died less than a year ago. You think about what that guy experienced. Like, you read some of the stories about, he's nearly beaten to death for trying to use a whites-only bathroom, for trying to sit in a whites-only waiting room at a bus station. And I think he was beaten like 36 or 37 times. To have any faith at all in human beings after they have literally tried to kill you for asking, not even like, he wasn't even asking for like the right to vote. He was beaten for like the right to sit on a bench in a shitty gas station, or a shitty bus station. You think about how discouraging that would be, and what courage it would take to not give up and to put your heart out there to be broken again and again and again. That's, to me, not just courageous, but it's heroic. I mean, that takes almost an inhuman amount of strength and discipline.
And when you talk about John Lewis, I also think how that relates to endurance. I mean, That was a long fight, man. Like longer than
Yeah.
we've been alive. And the endurance part of your book focus on Shackleton, and that's the name of the book too that everybody should read. It's phenomenal about Shackleton's expedition. But they got stuck in the ice, and his motto I'm going to say it wrong, fortitude vincimius, but basically it means
Sure.
by endurance we conquer. And I think of endurance is almost parallel to consistency. And I certainly identify this doing a podcast, shipping every week for 6.5 years, never missing. You are one of the most prolific writers in the world if you talk about your shipping schedule when it comes to publishing books. And so can you talk a little about, from a leadership perspective, and maybe related to yourself too, about the importance of, because I think this isn't very sexy, man, like consistently getting up and writing every day, or consistently doing whatever it is you do to ship work all the time. Like the daily grind of it isn't that sexy to people,
Right.
but it's why it's able to happen. And I think leaders, this is critical, is to have this skill of endurance and this willingness to be consistent on a daily basis.
It's funny you're talking about process, and then the Shackleton chapter, just a sense of how those books come together. That chapter, the Shackleton chapter, I actually ended up cutting from the book.
Oh, you did?
Maybe like 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago.
I have the copy that
you have the galley, which is like probably the third or fourth pass. But
Gotcha.
Even up until we went to the printers, I was still working on how I could make it tighter and cleaner and stronger. And so I ended up moving endurance to the second book. But the point is, it is a grind. People think that writing is like sitting down and just pouring your heart out on at the keyboard or whatever. First off, it's months and months and months or years of research. Then it's writing, but then it's also grueling edits where you're having to, Stephen King talks about killing your darlings. You have to go, I love this chapter, but if I had to cut one chapter from this section, what chapter would I cut? Because you're having to think about, not is it how you want it to be necessarily, but how would best make the argument or provide the experience that you want it to have. So the idea is, and I forget who said this, but the idea is like, amateurs look for inspiration, professionals show up and get to work. And so it isn't sexy, but it is a process. And I've found that if you commit to the process, work comes out of the other side of that. So I show up every day and I try to make a positive contribution to the project. And I know that if I do that enough times in a row, something publishable comes out of the other side of that.
You've proven to yourself that you can do that. What is the process? That I know some of it, you've talked about it before, about taking your kids on a walk early morning, not looking at your phone, getting to work as soon as you get back. Is that that's the process for you that you found makes you produce the most excellent work, I assume?
That's what the days look like. Yeah. But the process is, sitting down and tackling the smallest component part of the thing that day. So again, we in Marcus Aurelius actually talks about this. Says, don't despair. Don't let your imagination despair at the totality of the project or the tragedy or the crisis. He says, like, focus on what's immediately in front of you. So like each day, like today, I was working, we talked about that Churchill thing and the Battle of Britain. Like I was writing about that today. That's the smallest section that I have today. And that's like 700 or 800 words. So that, in an 80,000 word book. So, that's what I was working on today. So I have small pieces that I'm working on day in and day out. And I don't move on from one piece until I got it where it needs to be. And then they all come together, and then it's a process of reviewing and working on that too.
Outside of time with your family, what's your favorite thing to do?
Some sort of physical activity or exercise.
Run, all that?
Yeah, I either run, swim, or bike, essentially every day.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that physical practice of moving your body so important for you?
Well, first off, I think it's just
you like it. It's your favorite thing to do. So
yeah. It's a metaphor, right? Who's in charge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Me or the part of me that doesn't want to do stuff, right? So part of it's like I'm in charge, I decide. But I think a big part of it is it's the opposite of the job, right? Like running is the opposite of sitting in a chair at a computer, right? It's outside, it's for a short burst of time, it's physically engaging as opposed to mentally engaging. And yet it still kind of draws on the same skill set, willpower, fortitude, self-control, etc. I happen to find it's very adaptive to what I do professionally, but yeah, it's probably it's harder for me to not do those things than it is to do those.
Right.
Things.
You feel terrible if you don't do it.
Yes. So there's probably a certain amount of addiction to that as well, but yeah, I feel worse not doing it than doing.
I'm the same way. Like if I don't work out in the morning, the people closest to me know this now. It's just not going to be a good day. Like I can do it, but it's not very productive.
Yes.
And so I'm guessing that is part of the process for you to be such a prolific producer of work that is useful and helpful to others, is that you have to that's just got to be a part of what you do.
Well, the big thing for me in the pandemic is so I flew on Thursday for the first time that I have been away from my routine and my house I was doing the math, like 540 consecutive days. We went places as a family, but I was we drove, but I was still the same routine essentially, right? So, but this was I got on a plane and I slept in a hotel for the first time in 600 days, right? I was previously doing that once to twice per week on average. And so watching, I was under the impression I was pretty productive traveling, doing this schedule. It's been very different very illuminating to see the opportunity costs of, so you get a speaking offer and you go, okay, so it's X amount. That's what I'm getting paid. But it's harder to calculate what that costs because you tell yourself, oh, I'm still sleeping in a bed. I'm only gone for this amount. It's only a 3-hour flight, but it's harder to calculate, let's say you're operating at 70% capacity. Well, 3 days on the road is a day off, I think I've certainly emerged from this with a stronger sort of discipline about what I say yes to and what I say no to.
I was going to ask you, so how has it changed you? It feels to me like that you're just going to say no a lot more.
I hopefully, this is the struggle already, and it's weird how the pandemic has gone. It came to be that, when it's been weird, like, what do you say yes to? What do you say no to? Because it was stuff, you've been saying yes to stuff for a year and a half that hasn't happened. It just gets pushed, right? So it came to be that, like, I now have some stuff in October that's like, the most I've done in like 2 years, right? So having to go, oh, I need to cancel. So it's not just like saying no, like, what do I get myself out of?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's easy. It was easy to say no to stuff when doing it was illegal or when doing it was, at what risk to one's health. Now, now you actually have to have the self-control to be like, I don't want to do that. And I've read about this with parents too. Obviously, no one envies a parent of low means, but it's a tension when you're telling your kids no about something, not because you can't, but because it's no. You know what I mean? Like, no, just because. There's a great letter from the writer E.B. White. He was invited to be on a council put together by Eisenhower, some arts council or something. And he just said, I must decline for secret reasons. And, it's like, not no because I'm busy, but no because I don't want to. I'm not going to, like, what are you doing instead? Nothing. I'm going to be at home. So that's harder to do, obviously.
Man, you're so well read, and I love being a part of your email list to get all of the book recommendations and everything you do. And now you own a bookstore, so you're constantly thinking about books and inventory and what's going to be on your shelves. What are you selling? What do people like? If you think about, like, over history and over time of all the incredible people that you've been fortunate to meet, what are a few of the commonalities you found among people who sustain excellence?
Well, speaking of reading, I mean, one of my favorite quotes is that Truman line about how not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers, right? Mm-hmm. There's been almost no people that I have met who are truly successful at whatever they do who are not big readers. And I can think of a few exceptions. I won't like blow them up, but they're like people who are like either have severe dyslexia or just massively failed by, you know, the school system, to the point where like they're definitely a brilliant person who would read, but like reading is just not how their mind is able to work, right? So I think you find an intense curiosity, a desire for knowledge in these people. I do see self-discipline being a huge virtue there as well. That the paradox of success is that suddenly it's not that you can't do something, but you have to have the discipline not to do that thing that you could get away with, or that you do have the ability to do. And then maybe the third thing is the people that I really admire, that I aspire to be like, have some sort of element of service in what they do. So it's not simply about, you know, their own success or accomplishment, but some sort of larger purpose or mission. And the bookstore for me, I mean, it's a business and it can't lose lots of money. But as I sat down in late 2019, early 2020, and thought about like what I wanted to do next, my wife and I were talking about cool stuff. You know, we weren't thinking of opening a small town bookstore because it was a way to get rich quick. You know, it was a labor of love and a contribution we wanted to make to a community, to you know, a town and that sort of thing. So I think they are committed to doing something other than just, you know, racking up their own accomplishments.
You mentioned success a few times throughout the course of us talking. I think this is a hard question as I even think about my own answer. Like, how do you define that for yourself now, especially after everything you've done? I know you wrote a post about when you hit New York Times, I believe, for the first time. I think you expected it to be like this moment, and it was kind of like, on to the next, right? And now you've lived on New York Times bestseller lists of multiple books, multiple times for years. But like, how do you define success in your life?
Yeah, I actually have a good answer to this one. It may be because you already asked me this, but I spell success autonomy. Success is, do you have power over your own life, over the way that you spend your time, over who you spend time with, over the things that you spend time working on? Are there times or seasons where, you know, for a greater good or a certain accomplishment, you may have to give up a certain amount of autonomy to accomplish a certain thing? Yes, of course. But I think you and I both know a lot of people who are very, very successful, but you wouldn't trade places with them for any amount of money because they're not in control of their own life. They're a slave to some system they've set up or thing that they've done, and they can't stop. I know we're talking about me and like I actually like writing, so that's what I want to be doing. So when I talk about autonomy, I want the autonomy to sit and write. That's what I want to be doing.
And read, because
yes,
that obviously makes you you can tell in all of your books, you're like, this dude is so well read. It's just evident in the stories in the books. Obviously, you can't have all this stuff if you're not reading constantly.
Well, that's one of the sort of canaries in the coal mine for me, is like, if I know I'm making bad decisions or signing up for things, or I've set my schedule up improperly if I'm not reading on a consistent basis. That to me, because that's almost always the first thing that goes, because it requires focus and concentration and energy. But yeah, to me, success is being in command of your own life and your own decisions.
Love it. Courage is Calling is the book. Fortune Favors the Brave. It's really good. I appreciate you sent it to me, even if it's not fully accurate. Or maybe I got a piece of the next book, I guess.
You did. You got multiple chapters of the new book, and you got
cool.
it before anyone else. Yeah.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. And highly, highly encourage people to get it. It's a cover to cover read that it's one of those ones where I think the author earns the turn of the page, which I like to say that's what good authors do. You have to earn each turn. And I think you just like you do in all your work, but definitely this one for sure. So I really appreciate you being here, man. And I encourage people to get it. And, you know, it's number 6. I look forward to number 7 already, man. It's good to see you.
Please. I would love that. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, man.